Hello, welcome to Jazz Is.
Jazz Is
MasterClass series
at the National Jazz Museum.
At the National Jazz Museum in Harlem.
I am Sekou McMillan, the curator of special projects.
My name is Albert Marquez, Zach O'Farrell.
My name is Shirazette Titten.
And we are in conversation with the legendary Bertha Hope. Jazz could only have happened here in America.
The key to everything was the radio.
So this world is too dense. 15 minutes isn't enough to cover it all.
Are you ready? I am.
These were years where jazz and Harlem were synonymous. In those days, musicians and the best musicians in the world were coming to New York City to play and work. Those included... So for this second part, we're going to be talking about the jazz age in Harlem, those years around 1924 through 1930. If you think for a second about throwing a ball in the air, those couple of moments before the ball falls, before gravity takes hold of that ball, where it's right there and it's almost floating, just for that tiny, tiny fraction of time, that's like the jazz age in Harlem. A moment where everything is floating outside of the weight of time, of history, politics, of all these aesthetics. Nothing that I tell you can fully capture the energy and the magic of the jazz age in Harlem. And I would be remiss to try to weigh it down with too much information about the context, but it is important to understand how it happened and why it happened. First off, as I was speaking about last time on part one of the rise of jazz and the rise of Harlem, the situation for professional Black musicians had radically changed in 1921 with the foundation of Local 802, the American Federation of Musicians. And for the first time, Black professional musicians could be in the same union as white musicians, something that was extremely rare in the United States at that time. And as a result, a lot of musicians came to New York for work and found it in dance bands and cabarets and nightclubs and all kinds of spots that were growing in this new, really special neighborhood that was Harlem, because you had not the well below subpar housing of San Juan Hill, but luxury apartments that were being leased out to Black tenants in Harlem. Those years of the early 1920s were years of great optimism. And the story I had about Black Swan Records in many ways represents all of that. The period of 1924, 1925, 1926, these were years where jazz and Harlem were synonymous. In those days, musicians and the best musicians in the world were coming to New York City to play and work. Those included Sidney Bechet, who had come to New York for the first time in 1919, but had gone to Europe with Will Marion Cook and came back to Harlem and worked here through those years as a gun-for-hire musician. He's a master clarinet player and soprano saxophonist from New Orleans. You also had Coleman Hawkins at that time, basically inventing the idiom of jazz on the tenor saxophone. You had Bix Beiderbecke, a great cornet player from Davenport who had come up in the Chicago scene and who came to New York for the first time in 1924. And no one was more important in the idiom of jazz in New York City than Louis Armstrong, who came here actually right around the same time as Bix Beiderbecke in the late summer of 1924 to play at the Roseland Ballroom with Fletcher Henderson in Midtown. just a few blocks away from the Cinderella Ballroom where Bix Beiderbecke was playing. The Midtown dance hall scene was the absolute craze of New York's nightlife in those boom years of the mid-1920s. And a number of musicians from Harlem found work in these venues, but for the most part, they were completely segregated and barred for any Black patrons to be joining them. Fletcher Henderson's band would come play in Harlem at a lot of the theaters, like the Alhambra Theater or the Lafayette Theater or the Lincoln Theater, which were vaudeville houses that had become open to and desegregated at the time that Harlem became the Mecca of Black New York, and really in this period of Black America. Harlem and New York City has the largest Black population of any city now starting in 1920. The migration is only increasing too during these years. Now, 1924, 1926, in that boom time, still these dance halls are in Midtown. And all that changes in 1926 with the opening of the Savoy Ballroom. The Savoy Ballroom, in many ways, was the peak of those optimistic years, and it also led to a great change in the economics of professional musicians in Harlem in the 1920s. For the first time, a ballroom of the scale, grandeur, prestige of the great Midtown palaces, such as the Roseland, the Arcadia, the Cinderella, had opened in Harlem's own streets. It was at Lenox Avenue. It was a block long between 140th Street and 141st Street. There were 2 bandstands for continuous dancing. And at the Savoy Ballroom, which opened in March of 1926, patrons from Harlem felt that for the first time they had their own ballroom, that this was a place that they could go, they could feel safe, single women could go and feel safe. And on that note, it's really important too to note that the majority of Black Southerners who migrated north were actually single Black women. And that should tell you a lot about what the audience of these these venues, such as the Savoy Ballroom, which was unique, but other venues, and the pitfalls and perils of nightlife at that time as well. Now, the Savoy took off pretty quickly, 1926. It was a risky venture. It was white owned and started by the owners of the Roseland, in fact, but it paid off pretty quickly, and suddenly the Savoy Ballroom became the center of musical nightlife in Harlem at this time. The other important thing to note about the 1920s and the change in the professional working musician's life was that James Reese Europe's Clef Club no longer really was necessary by the mid-1920s because musicians had the opportunity, and most had to, work in the main union, Local 802. In many ways, the story of desegregation is one that has a trade-off with jazz, and it's one of the most complicated parts of the whole music. Segregation, in many ways, made the music, but the music also was a challenge to segregation, and the music finding its footing within the changes that it itself was demanding is one of the most complicated components of jazz that no one will ever fully understand. But it was a big part of it. Now, the Clef Club basically faded out in the mid-1920s, and there was a need for a new place for musicians to still consider their home, working musicians in Harlem. And that came about in the late 1920s with a place started by a musician from Chicago named Bert Hall, who opened the Rhythm Club. Now, Bert Hall didn't live all that long. He died in 1932, but the Rhythm Club lasted a long time. And the Rhythm Club was a gathering place for musicians, a place where they could leave their instruments, a place where they could go between gigs. This was the place where Fletcher Henderson played pool. This is the place where musicians coming in from out of town would go to prove themselves in jam sessions. When Jelly Roll Morton came to New York from Chicago, he went to the Rhythm Club and he played there all the time. He was a mainstay at the Rhythm Club. When a young drummer from Baltimore named Chick Webb came up to Harlem, he went to the Rhythm Club and he formed his band from musicians that he would hear at the Rhythm Club. And Duke Ellington, a great band leader, pianist who was from Washington, D.C., gave Chick Webb his first gig as a band leader from meeting him and seeing him around the Rhythm Club. The Rhythm Club was the locus of the jazz and professional working musicians world in Harlem. It was, by the way, the Rhythm Club was on 7th Avenue. Its location changed a few times, but it was around 135th Street and 7th Avenue. Now, jazz in these years of the 1920s was going through some of its own changes. And the period of 1923 to the early 30s is the period that I call classic jazz for a few reasons. It was the period where jazz had become completely differentiated from ragtime. When I hear the music of jazz in the 1920s, what thrills me to no end is the rhythm, the syncopation, the basic beat, but also the fierceness, the intensity, the spirit that these musicians are playing. And I think that no matter what information you hear, nothing can best convey the humor, the joy, the tragedy, the blues, the whole emotional, the affective experience of living in Harlem in the 1920s and just listening to those records. And no band was more expressive in those days than Duke Ellington's band. Duke Ellington, as I said, was from DC, and he had his big break when he opened at the Cotton Club in 1927. Now, the Cotton Club was a nightclub that opened in 1924. Originally, the band that played there was from Missouri. They were the Cotton Club Orchestra. Later, they become Cab Calloway's orchestra. But the Cotton Club was barred to Black patrons. It was mob-owned. The only Black patrons that could get in were celebrities who were very wealthy, and even they had to usually sit in the periphery. It was a space that was really the center of a whole part of nightlife growing in Harlem, which was called slumming. This is wealthy white patrons coming to Harlem to see shows full of racist stereotypes, but it was a huge source of income for working musicians and an opportunity for publicity. And Duke Ellington fully understood that opportunity. Duke Ellington took the sounds of Harlem and blended them through this new music of jazz with great soloists and the birth of the solo in this time as well. Louis Armstrong, Coleman Hawkins, as I said, these guys, they were coming from all kinds of different backgrounds, and Ellington understood that Harlem was a melting pot. It's also really important to consider in this time that by the 1920s, a quarter of the Black population of Harlem was born outside of the United States. We have a big population now that's coming in from the Caribbean and the West Indies. And a number of these musicians, including one of the great cornetists of that time, Thomas Morris, who played with Sidney Bechet, were making names for themselves. And there were so many others. So in the 1920s, Duke Ellington's music, the key points here are the birth of the classic jazz idiom, Louis Armstrong and the pioneering early jazz soloists coming largely out of New Orleans, playing with their own fierceness, spontaneity, and creativity. And the fusion of all of that into what we should know as the early big bands. In the mid-1920s, in places like the Savoy Ballroom, venues that were large for multiple dancers, you needed more instruments to convey the music, to create volume, and these big bands with arranged parts, which were coming out of the whole dance band tradition of these ballrooms, bands like Art Hickman and Paul Whiteman. Fletcher Henderson had the great Black Big Band at the Roseland. These bands were changing the whole sound of jazz and presenting soloists, arrangements, compositions that told the whole story of this place at that time. It was a great moment, but it was not meant to last. The Great Depression began with the Wall Street crash of October 1929, and things would rapidly change from there.